Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our first ever Maine Voices live stream. I was thinking about the differences today between our live events at One Longfellow, which we do miss, but also this live stream, and there are actually a few advantages. First, with 458 registered guests, 275 of you would have been on the wait list. And I don't need to remind you to all silence your cell phones because you're automatically muted. And unlike One Longfellow, this event is BYOB. So cheers. And we also don't mind if you get up and go refill your drink either. We won't hear you. I want to thank our sponsors, HM Payson, our presenting sponsor, who has been with us since the beginning of Maine Voices, and obviously ready to make any leap wherever we may take them, including online tonight. So thank you to HM Payson. Also, thank you to Stroudwater Lodge, the law firm of Murray Plum Murray, Portland Downtown, and Hub Furniture. Their support for this program enables us to bring you the critical local news you need every day in the Portland Press Herald. Now, Bob and Lois are going to talk until about 7:40, 7:45, and then we're going to take questions from all of you. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by two ways. You can either raise your hand and we'll bring you, we'll unmute your mic and you can ask your question live, or you can submit them via the Q&A. We won't be using the chat for questions, but we'd love for you to share your thoughts about Lois's work in the chat for others to read. Make sure you set your chat preference to everyone. So now to introduce you to tonight's host and guest. Bob Keyes writes about the visual and performing arts for the Portland Press Herald and the Maine Sunday Telegram. He appreciates that his job requires him to visit museums, when possible, and attend plays and concerts across Maine, and he most enjoys interviewing artists in their studios. Lois Lowry's debut novel, A Summer to Die, and the following Anastasia Krupnik established her as an author who could relate to both the monumental and everyday struggles of youth. She twice has received the Newbery Medal, each year given to the most distinguished piece of fiction published for young people. Number the Stars remains one of the best-selling children's books of all time, and The Giver is a staple of middle school reading lists. Earlier this month, she released On the Horizon, her 46th book, and her first written in verse. Drawn from her childhood memories in Japan and Hawaii, along with research, it tells the story of soldiers and civilians whose lives were lost or uprooted by the bombings of Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima. Lowry has also worked as a photojournalist, and her portrait of a Danish girl is on the cover of many editions of Number the Stars. A mother and grandmother, she has lived all over the world, but now divides her time between Maine and Florida. Please welcome to the Zoom stage, Bob Keyes and Lois Lowry.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa. And hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's great to see everybody virtually. It's wonderful to have such a large crowd. And Lois, thanks for joining us under such unusual and, dare I say, dramatic circumstances for our community and for our country.
Yeah,
we really appreciate it. I want to start our conversation just by asking how you're doing, how you're faring, and how you're feeling these days.
Well, physically, I'm feeling just fine, so that's good.
Good.
And also, isolation is an interesting thing for a writer because it's what we usually seek. So solitude is my normal state, and this is not unusual for me. So I'm not having too hard a time with it. I am having a hard time with the fact that people I care about are ill with this virus. But I'm also encouraged by the slow progress forward, and I think eventually we'll get through this okay.
Yes. You mentioned this is a good, isolation is a good time for writers. You have a book out. This normally would be a time you would be out on the road. You are doing this event as a virtual event. I imagine you're staying busy promoting your book online.
Well, not as busy as it would be if I were going to 8 different cities in 10 days, as I had planned to do. All of that, of course, was canceled. So I am doing some promotion online, but I also am using this time of enforced solitude and quarantine to start a new book, something I hadn't intended to do this month or this week, but here I sat and the ideas were coming to me. And so that's how I'm spending my time when I'm not talking to people by virtual whatever.
So tell us about the book. What are you writing about? And has the current situation inspired you?
I'm not going to talk much about what I'm currently working on because it's in such early stages, but I will say that this often starts a book, a little glimmer of something I've read or thought or heard of that stays for some reason in my brain, creating questions. And it may be there for some years. I think I could look at books that I've written in the past and be aware that those ideas percolated in my brain for a very long time. And then something triggers it and it comes to the foreground. And so something I had read, again, I'm not going to be too specific, but it was about a young person, kind of mysterious, unanswered questions, and it had happened long ago and in a different place. So that required research, which I've been doing. And of course, even without being able to go to the library, you can do a lot of research online. So I've been sitting here reading books, taking notes, and actually starting to write. It's going to be a long haul because it's a period of time that I knew nothing about. And so there's a steep learning curve, but that's always exciting for me.
Good. Congratulations for having this time to do that. And I understand your reluctance to want to say too much about it. I respect that. And you mentioned the idea of an idea sitting with you for many years before you might revisit it, and that leads to a good transition to talk about On the Horizon. The early stages of this book began when you were just a young child, and you were living, as Lisa said, in Pearl Harbor, and then later in Japan during the time of World War II. This book is a memoir told, I believe, in a series of vignettes, if I'm not mistaken, and it explores those years when you were a child. Why did it take so long for you to return to those years and explore that time?
There were two specific things that had entered my consciousness, originating in my own past. And one was this, that I had been born in Honolulu. And my father had been a very fine photographer, though that wasn't his profession. And so we grew up with lots of good home movies, unlike the amateurish films that most people have where people are doing this and saying hi. Dad's were very professional. He had very professional equipment. And when I was growing up, we had no television. It was early days. And so that was always fun. When he got out the home movies, set up the projector, it was very ritualistic. Mother would draw the shades and we would set up the screen. And then now and then he would show something backwards. And that was very exciting. I mean, those were so kind of primitive times in terms of technology. But that was part of my history. And it was not until I was grown and encountered those old films again when my father was getting old. And I had them, they were deteriorating. And so I had them transferred to videotape. It was very early days of videotape. I had just bought a VCR. And then before I sent the tape to my dad, I put it into my brand new VCR and showed it in my living room to some friends. It was probably not quite as boring as people's slides of 27 different countries on their vacation. But nonetheless, my friends were patient. And one of my guests was a man who had graduated from Annapolis, who had been captain of a nuclear submarine, and was now a Boston lawyer when I knew him. And he sat there watching those films politely. And there, once again, was little Lois playing on the beach with her grandmother visiting from Wisconsin. And it's a lovely scene. Small child on the beach with a shovel. And a beautiful beach. Waikiki then was not thronged with tourists. This would have been 1940. And then it went to the next scene where my sister and I are watering flowers in our mother's garden. But my friend John said, wait a minute, can you go back and show that beach scene again? And so I did. And he pointed out something that had always been there, but which I had never noticed before. And that was that in the background, on the horizon, as it were, was the outline, the silhouette, kind of shrouded in mist, of a ship. And John, being a naval officer, identified it. He said, that's the Arizona. And when he said that, everybody in the room kind of gasped. Kids today don't know what that means. And maybe this book will teach them that. What it meant to me was, there I was, 3 years old, laughing on the beach, and there behind me in the background on the horizon were 1,200 young men who very soon would all be dead. And that stuck with me. It haunted me. I didn't know what to do with it. And so it just lodged there the way things do in your subconscious. And then another thing happened. I went to Miami to receive the Newbery Medal for the book called The Giver. And I met a man named Alan Say who was receiving the Caldecott Medal for illustration that same year. He gave me a copy of his book, beautiful book called Grandfather's Journey. I gave him a copy of The Giver. He drew a little illustration when he signed his name for me. And so I, trying to keep up and be competitive, I couldn't draw an illustration, but I wrote my name in Japanese. Alan Say is Japanese. And I gave him that and he chuckled and asked me how I happened to be able to do that. And I explained that I had lived in Japan as a child. He asked me where I'd lived. I told him, and he said, that's where I lived. I had, when I lived in Tokyo as a kid, 11, 12 years old, I had a bicycle that I used to ride around the streets of Tokyo, and I used to stop and watch kids on a playground. We never spoke to each other. It was so recently that we were enemies, but we were curious about each other, I think. And one of those children was Alan Say. His name then was Koichi Say. He had changed his name when he moved to the United States to an American name. And when I gave him that book and wrote my name, told him where I had lived, he said, were you the girl on the green bicycle? And that stayed with me too. That haunted me, that odd coincidence of our meeting again 50 years later. If I had written that in a book as a piece of fiction, an editor would likely have put in the margin credibility issues here. It just seems so unlikely. Alan and I have remained friends since that day. And incidentally, I got an email from him just the other day. Whenever an email arrives and the title line is Konnichiwa, Lois-san, I know it's from Alan. He lives on the West Coast. And he said something like, we're in another war now. This time we're on the same side. But at any rate, I took that story of Alan and me, and Alan had been a child who saw the bomb go off in southern Japan when he was 8 years old, and the story of me in front of the Arizona, and I put those things all together. There was no plot, there was no novel to be written, but there were images. And that's why the book, I've forgotten how you described it, vignettes, you used the word. I've actually written them in verse. Little pieces, little images of the young men who were on the Arizona and of the young people who were affected by the bombing 4 years later in August of 1945. And then the third section is how those two sets of people come together as Alan and I came together many years later.
It's such an amazing story about you and Alan. I've heard it before, but even to hear it again, it actually gives me chills. As you said, it's such a strange, interconnected world, and no one would believe it if it weren't true. What do you take away from that story all these years later? Why do you think it happened?
What do I think which happened?
Your meeting with Alan.
I don't know why it happened. But I know as a result of it happening, it heightened my awareness of the way we're all connected on this planet. And it's something we're seeing now, I think, during this strange time of a pandemic, when you confession, when I say, when you go to Facebook, I don't know if you do, but I go to Facebook too often, and there are people showing the view from their window. There are people singing in their doorways, and there's a feeling of connectedness which has always been there, but it's there more than ever now. But I think this book, On the Horizon, I'm just going to hold up a copy. Now I'm going to feel like the guy on a shopping network trying to sell you a Ginsu knife. But I think this book tries to say that about the way we're all connected on this planet, and it's time that we pay more attention to that.
Yes. It's interesting to think about On the Horizon in the context of your young life in 1944 compared to young kids today dealing with this pandemic. World War II was a shared global crisis that shaped the world and linked kids across the globe for generations. The coronavirus may well do the same. What's your message for kids today who are stuck at home and wondering about their future, just as you started to do not too long after that day on the beach?
Well, I think the best message we can give today is to the kids of today that they're the ones who are going to create the future. I'm going to be gone. I'm 83. I almost said 82, but I'm 83 actually, and I'm not going to be around all that much longer. But these kids who are growing up now and will have this in their history, the way I've had World War II in mine, they're going to be the future. And I think it's important for them to begin to realize how as individuals they can shape the world. They're not just victims of what the world does to them. They're the ones who create the world. When I was a kid in school, I don't know if schools still teach this, but we were given lengthy courses in civics teaching us about how our government worked. And I think it's important for kids to become aware of that and become part of that and participate in that. And they're not too young to be made aware of the importance of their vote. That's my current soapbox, I think.
Yeah, that's a good lesson. As a writer of novels for young people and others, what are you most concerned about in terms of the impact of kids of the virus on their psyches? You talked about some of the positive things. What do you worry about in terms of the situation?
Well, I think sadly, during this period of time, they're losing out on a lot of what was so important to me in my school days. I have a grandson who was sent home from college his freshman year, and I hope he'll be able to go back in the fall, but we don't know yet. I think isolation is going to be much harder on the kids than it is on adults like me. As I say, I'm not that much affected by having to stay home alone. I kind of like being alone. But kids need the interaction. They need to learn to live with each other in communities, and they're missing out on that. I hope for not too long, and I hope we can make up for it for them.
Yeah. Okay. Before we get off the topic of current events, you live in a community deeply impacted by the virus. I'm interested in how you're dealing with that just on a personal level. You mentioned in a phone call the other day that you take your dog out for a walk and not much more than that. What is it like in your neighborhood right now?
You see people walking, and I am one of them, and we wave to each other from opposite sides of the road. We're very careful here. Dogs, of course, need to be walked, as does mine. But aside from that, people are not gathering in any way. And even when we walk, we're wearing masks. This is an older community, of course. I think everybody who lives here is over 65, so it's a very vulnerable population. And some people in this community have died. So we're all very aware of that, very aware of each other. And at the same time, we're all being more social perhaps than we used to be. And we prop up our phones on FaceTime and have a glass of wine together without actually being in each other's houses. My son, who lives in Portland, dropped off groceries this afternoon. He left them on my porch. I waved to him through the window, and then he drove away, and I went out and brought them in. So these are strange times that it's taking a little getting used to.
Yeah, a lot of people want to ask about the similarities between these times and the dystopian world that you wrote about in The Giver. That's on my list, but I think the way the conversation's going, I want to get to it now. Do you see some connections? One reader asked directly, do you see any parallels between the challenges faced by your main characters in The Giver or Number the Stars and the challenges of young people today?
Well, Number the Stars and The Giver are two very different books, and yet they probably have some things in common. Number the Stars is set in Denmark in 1943, so it's during World War II at a time when Denmark was occupied by the Nazis. And it has to do with the way the Danish population, unlike any other European population, saved their Jewish population. I think there were about 7,000 Jews in Denmark, and Denmark is a very small country. And they were hidden by the Christian population and smuggled to Sweden where they would be safe. It was an amazing act of integrity, I guess would be the best word, for a population to rise up against such odds and do that. But being a book for kids, the main character is a kid. Children have often asked me why the main character is not the Jewish child. And I explain that in a book, the main character is the one who makes choices and decisions. The reader follows along with what choices the main character makes. And in this case, the Jewish people in Denmark had no choices, sadly, to make. It was the Christian population who made the choice to hide them and save them. So it's the Christian child who helps to save her Jewish friend. So it's a story of personal integrity. The Giver also, of course, because all my books are for young people, they all have a young protagonist. The main character is a 12-year-old boy. Oh, and incidentally, I'm going to go back to Number the Stars for a minute because you referred to the Danish child on the cover. And I'm just going to correct that because I took that photograph and she was a beautiful child and she was Swedish. As close as I could get to a Danish child, and she certainly had the right Scandinavian look, but she was Swedish. In The Giver, the boy is 12, fictional boy, and he's caught in a society not of his making. And it's a more complicated one to describe. But I think the thing that kids should take away from The Giver is that the world in which Jonas lives, which is a very comfortable, safe world, but has a deep underbelly of corruption, is a world that came about gradually, long before that boy was part of it. And it would have come about very gradually, created by people with good intentions. One small example is this. The world in which the boy lives has no books. It has no art, no music, and no books anymore. It takes you a while to realize that when you're reading the book. But how did that happen? Well, many years earlier, probably, somebody with the best of intentions would have said, you know what? We don't have wars anymore. That's a very good thing, but war was scary. Why should our children have to read about that? Let's take all the books that mention war out of our libraries. Let's not publish any of those anymore. And then someone else might have said, we don't have cancer anymore. We cured that. Let's get rid of all the books that might scare you by talking about something like cancer. And very gradually, and with good intentions, in most cases, all the books would disappear. And it would be a great loss, as it was in this community where the boy lives. There are no books anymore. So as the boy, I can't go through the whole plot here, but as he gradually realizes the corruption on which his world is based, he decides to take action to try to change things. That is where the book is similar to Number the Stars, in which a little girl tries to take action to save her friend's life. And I think that's what kids will take away from it. And let me give you an example of something, although this doesn't address either of the specific issues in either book. I'm just remembering an email I got not terribly long ago. When you get an email, of course, you don't know where the person is unless they tell you. And so I didn't know where this came from, except that the boy told me he lived in the South. He told me he was 16. He told me his first name, not his last. And he said his father was a pastor. He lived in a very conventional and conservative family. And he said, I've been very depressed. He said, I'm sleeping my life away because I don't know what else to do. He said, I'm gay and I can't tell anyone. He said, my parents expect me to finish school, go to college, get a job, get married, have children, lead a life like theirs. And he said, I can't do it. And he said, I had to read this book, the book by me, The Giver. I had to read this book in school. And here is a boy, he said, who like me, knows that he can't do it any longer. And so he takes a risk and makes a move and tries to change things for himself. The book actually has an ambivalent ending. I've always thought of it as a happy ending, and this boy did too. I wrote him back, of course, and I heard from him one more time. He just said, thank you. I didn't know if you would read my email or reply to it. He said, but it's going to be a help to know somebody out there is caring about me. So I don't know what's become of him. I know what I hope for. But I do know too that for a writer, it's the thing you most hope for, that something you've written will speak to one person and bring about a change that will perhaps be a meaningful change in his or her life. That's the most I can ever hope for with a book.
Well, you've done that a lot. You know, the other thing is I'm listening to you talk and just thinking back on some of your topics and books. You've never shied away from difficult subjects, and the kids in your books, the subjects of your books, have dealt with serious things, and all of them. Kids are really resilient, and certainly that's something you bring out in your writing. I'm not sure what the question is in that, other than if you could maybe just talk about the resilience of kids and their ability to deal with things. And how you reflect that in your books.
When I've heard, as I occasionally have heard from a parent who is distressed because their kid is reading a book by me that is about a distressing subject, I always try to explain to them that reading a book is a way we rehearse our lives. That every kid is going to encounter things farther along in life, later, I hope, rather than sooner, but nonetheless, they're going to see people they love die. They're going to have failures. And reading a book about somebody who has had experiences like that is a way that they can experience it well distanced from it. And think about what they would do if, what they will do when. I think a book and reading a book in a comfortable chair with your dad in the next room or your teacher up at her desk, somebody you can talk to about the book, is the best possible way to prepare yourself for life. And life is going to be hard, no question, at some points. And reading is, as far as I can tell, the best possible preparation for those bad and difficult moments.
Absolutely. And of course, you've written so many books. You have experience of writing about pandemics before, and not just pandemics, but pandemics in Portland. If you would take us back to the writing of Like the Willow Tree and the research that you did for that book. You told me a few weeks ago you were alarmed when you reread the first few chapters, how similar they were to current events. Yes. Talk about that book and why you had to revisit it, please.
Yeah, I don't remember what year this was. It was perhaps 10 years ago that Scholastic Publishing came to me or got in touch with me and asked if I would be interested in writing a book for the series that they call Dear America. It's quite a wonderful series, and I think teachers especially like it. It focuses each book on an event in American history but it's always as seen through the eye of a child who's on the periphery of that event. And there are many of these books, and they've been very popular. And I've never done one before. They're done by different authors. And so Scholastic asked me if I would do one, and I said yes. They offered me one particular event in history, which was intriguing, but it would have involved my going to other places that I didn't have time to do. So I suggested to them that I write about the Shaker community in South Day Lake, Maine, which is quite near where I spend my summers in an old farmhouse. And so they agreed to that, and that was the intention of the book, to introduce children to the historical community of Shakers and that little bit of American history, which is very interesting. But in order to do that, I had to have a child telling the story. And I had to place that child with the Shakers. In order to do that, I had to make her an orphan, because that's how the Shakers increased their numbers. They also relied on converts, of course, but the Shakers were celibate. They didn't reproduce or marry. And so they relied on people who converted to their faith, or to the orphans that they took in and brought up, and many of whom stayed as part of the community, although they were not required to. And so I created a little girl in Portland, Maine. She lived in Deering. I even named the street. And it was 1918, October. And the book begins with her about to celebrate her 11th birthday. And she's very upset because her parents have promised to take her to the movies. I'm doing my research. I found what movie was playing in Portland, Maine on October 4th, 1918. And it was a Tom Mix, a Western. But suddenly, she says, the movie theater is closed. The mayor of Portland has closed the movie theater and closed the schools and closed the dance halls and every place where people gather because of this dumb disease. And I don't know anybody who has this disease. And I think it's really stupid, and my birthday is ruined. Well, of course, it was the flu epidemic of 1918. And so I did the research on what that was like in Portland, and not just in Portland, but up the coast as well. And that's how the book begins. And within days, of course, the child is orphaned by that epidemic and is taken then to live with the Shakers, which then is the main section of the book. But the publisher called me recently and asked me to write a new introduction to that book because it's so timely now. And so I hauled out the book, found a copy of it, and reread that early part of the chapters about the flu epidemic. And it was really kind of startling as I sat here quarantined in my own house and read about this child whose father comes home from work and says, people are not going to work anymore because of this illness, but that's ridiculous. He said, how will commerce go on? I'm going back to the office. And off he goes. And as he turns to leave after saying this, he leans down to the baby carriage on the front porch and kisses the baby, the little girl's little sister. And as I reread it, I found myself thinking, oh, please don't kiss the baby. But of course he does, and the mother, the father, and the baby within days are all dead of the flu. In that particular epidemic, people died very quickly. And so that was, let me hold this up. They're putting a new cover on it. I don't know what the new one will look like, but this is set, look, it says Portland, Maine, 1918. The Shakers at the Shaker Village very kindly gave me access to all their old records, so I was able to go through and read what happened each day in the fall and winter of 1918, 1919 in that village, so that the actual events that happened are incorporated into the plot of the book. It was wonderful fun to write it. And I was told afterwards by the people at the Shaker Village that it was quite accurate. I was glad to hear that.
Prior to your research, did you know much about the flu, the 1918 flu?
You know, I remembered that had happened, and I had read about certain people. For example, the writer Mary McCarthy. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but I remember that her parents She was orphaned by that epidemic. Her parents both died when she was a child. And that happened, of course, to a great many people, but I had stupidly never asked my own parents about it. We always lose people too soon because we've forgotten to ask them things. And my parents would have been young then, 12 and 13. They were born in 1905, 1906. And so I know they must have been affected by it. Their lives must have been affected by it. I know that I had asked my mother about the Depression and heard fascinating stories about, her father was a banker when the Great Depression began. So I knew those stories, but I had not gone back far enough, had not asked her about the flu epidemic. I regret that.
Yep. I think there are a lot of folks are in your situation, in my situation. My grandmother was born in 1897, and I never asked her about this. Never occurred to me.
Yeah.
Yep. Before we get to reader and participant questions, I want to ask a little bit about some of your movies. I think you've had 4 books turned into movies, including The Giver, which was a huge success. But out now is The Willoughbys. I actually watched quite a bit of it the other night on Netflix. I believe it's one of the most streamed movies in the country at the moment. And we could talk about that in a second. But what I really want to know is the level of involvement that you've been able to have in the movie projects that have come out of your books, and if you had anything to do with the Willoughbys at all.
Okay. First 2 movies way back, they were made for TV movies, early books of mine. They were not very good. I won't even bother talking about them. And then The Giver was made, I think, in 2014. It had been out there for a long time. Jeff Bridges had bought the rights to it because he wanted to direct it and star his father, Lloyd Bridges, as the old man, the giver. And then it hadn't happened. His father had died eventually. Jeff was by then old enough to play the role himself. So someone else directed and Jeff played the role. And I didn't write the script. They made certain changes, of course, because movies always do. It took me a while to figure this out and come to terms with it. And I'll try to explain it to you now, what I figured out for myself. When you write a book, when I write a book, I'm writing the words on a page, but I'm seeing the scene in my mind. I describe the character, but I can see what the character looks like. And yet, this is what it took me a while to realize. The person reading the book isn't seeing what I'm seeing. They're bringing their own images and their own memories and their own imaginations. And so the book that I write is never the book that they read. And then a movie maker comes along, and of course I want the movie to look exactly like I saw the book. And it doesn't happen, and at first I'm always dismayed. Oh my goodness, it's not supposed to look like that, but of course it can't because they've got their own vision of it. However, Jeff was very kind in including me in a number of ways. I remember going out to Los Angeles. They filmed it in South Africa, but I went out to the director's house in Los Angeles and sat like this with him, talking to people in South Africa, looking at designs for the costumes. And they seemed really to appreciate my opinion. And in fact, they sometimes took my advice, not always. The director also emailed me frequently, just with little questions. For example, how should the boys' bedroom be decorated? And I said, well, it should be very plain, functional, but not really decorated. If you want to have something on the wall, it wouldn't be art of any sort. There's none of that in their world, but you could put something educational, like a chart of the table of elements. And indeed, when they invited me to come to South Africa and watch the filming, they showed me the set of the boys' bedroom, and there is the periodic table of elements. I thought, oh yay, that was my little contribution. However, I will say that my grandson, when I described that to him, how old would he have been? He's now 19, so he was probably 14 or so. And I described that to him, and he said, when is this taking place? 50 years in the future? And I said, yeah, maybe 50 years in the future. And he said, well, there's not going to be any helium. Who knew? And he said, there will be new elements. So it was an inaccurate table of elements on the boys' bedroom. Okay, so they made the film. they actually offered to let me be in the Council of Elders, sitting on stage wearing a robe during the great ceremony in the film. But I watched them rehearsing for that, and it looked so boring to sit there. I said, thanks, but I think I'll pass. So at any rate, they were very kind to me and included me and sought my opinion and often ignored it, but occasionally took my advice, not often enough. And then came The Willoughbys, which was a book I had written later. And this was to be an animated film, and they did not seek my advice at all. In fact, they would not let me see the script, so I didn't know what they were doing with the story. Again, their vision of the characters was going to be different from mine, and I knew that at the outset. And also, an animated film is not the same as human beings, so I was prepared for that. However, with the movie coming up, the publisher asked me if I would write a sequel to The Willoughbys because they thought the movie would propel interest. Here's a copy of the new version, the new book of the Willoughbys. This is the one that the movie's from. And then this is a preliminary, this will come out in September. This is the sequel, The Willoughbys Return. But they asked me if I would write the sequel, and I said, sure, that'd be fun. But I didn't know how what they were doing with the movie, how the movie was going to end. And so I wrote the sequel based on the ending of the first book. Turns out the movie ends differently. So the sequel will be a little askew, but it's fun anyway, and I think kids will enjoy it. And I think kids, housebound as they are probably loving having a fun movie to watch. Even though it makes me cringe that, I mean, this is silly, but in the book, there are the 4 children. There's Tim, and then there are the twins, identical twins, and then the youngest child is Jane, the little girl. But in the movie, Jane is older than the twins. Now, why does that freak me out? It shouldn't bother me at all, but it does. I keep wanting to say, Jane is supposed to be younger than that.
That's funny. Yeah, well, I watched it, most of it the other night. I enjoyed it. I'm not going to tell you, well, I didn't make it all the way to the end, let me put it that way. But I enjoyed the movie, and I was glad to become a little bit familiar with what they were trying to do, at least. So, all right, so I believe we have a lot of questions. We have just a little bit of time left. Folks who are out there listening, if you have questions, it's best to put them in the Q&A. Lois, I believe, will be able to see the chat, but I think we're going to answer questions through the Q&A mode. And at some point, Strawberry, if you can help me with that, that would be great. I do have a couple of questions here to get that started. These are questions that readers had sent in earlier. And related to movies, do you wish any of your other books would be made into movies? And if so, which ones and why?
In the past, the 2 that were made into television movies were one called Find a Stranger, Say Goodbye, although the movie people changed the title of it. I've forgotten the title. And the other was a book called Taking Care of Terrific, and it was an afternoon special movie. It had the same title. This is some years ago. Right now, Number of the Stars is under option. You know, everything is so stalled at the moment because of the coronavirus that who knows what will happen next with these things. But there is a movie maker wanting to make a film of Number of the Stars. And there's also a Broadway producer wanting to make a musical out of The Giver. Who knows if those things will ever happen? The world is changing, so.
Have you ever written music?
Have I what?
Written music?
Have I written music? Me? No, heavens.
Yeah,
no.
you mentioned a musical. Yeah,
No,
okay.
no,
I do want to ask you, I want to ask about On the Horizon before I forget. Have you written much poetry?
I have occasionally. I had a friend, he died this past year, who was a very well-known anthologist of poetry, mostly for young people. His name was Lee Bennett Hopkins. And every now and then he would email me and say, would you write me a poem about, and he would give some topic. Most recently, and this book isn't out yet, he asked me this not terribly long before he died. Write me a poem which is an elegy to a pet mouse. So I did that. But I haven't written serious verse until this book.
Was it hard? Was it hard for you to make that transition?
No, the book seemed to want to be written that way. It seemed to lend itself to that. So it wasn't hard so much as it was challenging. I think the two things are different. It was an interesting challenge more than a difficult one.
I have a couple questions here. Same question. Was The Giver influenced by Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale?
The Handmaid's Tale was published, if I remember correctly, around 1985, and I read it when it was published. I have not reread it recently, but I remember being very affected by it when it was published. And it would have gone into my subconscious and stayed there. When I wrote The Giver, which would have been, say, 1993 perhaps, or 92, so 7 years later perhaps, I was not consciously aware of thinking of The Handmaid's Tale, and yet it would have been there in my subconscious, and it would have affected my thinking without my being aware of it. I'm quite certain of that. And it in a way, dealt with the same issue, with the gradual corruption of our government, which happened slowly and insidiously, and oh gosh. And I have not, I should add, I have bought but not yet read the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. But I should mention, for those who don't know, that there are three, not sequels, but three books that follow The Giver, so that by the time you finish the fourth one, you know what has happened to all those characters, Jonas and Gabriel the baby, who in the fourth book is 14 years old. Everything is, I hope, tied up and concluded by the fourth book.
All right.
So Bob, we do have a couple of hands up. Let's see. Amy Sinkinson, you are all set to ask your question.
Hi, Lois. Thank you so much for answering my question. We're coming to you from Pennsylvania.
Where I grew up.
Yes, I know. I was an English teacher. My son is currently in 8th grade and just finished The Giver. So Lucas, say hi.
Hi, Lois.
Hi.
Go ahead, Lucas has a question for you, actually. Go ahead.
So what inspired you to write The Giver?
Well, you know, there are probably many answers to that question, so I'll try to give you the briefest one. When I was, whatever year it was, when it was time to write a new book, but I hadn't yet come up with an idea for a new book, my father was very old, in his 90s, and I visited him once every 6 weeks or so, flew down to Virginia where he lived, and I became aware that though he didn't have Alzheimer's, but he was losing bits and pieces of his memory, and I became aware on one visit that he had forgotten my sister. I had a sister 3 years older than I, and she had died young. And my father, we were going through some old photographs, and he suddenly looked at one and said, "Oh, there's your sister." And then he said, what happened to her? And I had to tell him about her death. And driving my rental car back to the airport that day, I began to think about that. I began to think, what if, and that's a phrase that always triggers beginnings of stories. What if there were a way we could manipulate human memory and somehow give someone a pill or a shot, and it would obliterate all the sad memories that they have, or all the things that frighten them. And that was the beginning of The Giver. When I got home, I knew I would use a young person, because I always do. And so I created a boy living in a place where they had found a way to do that. So he lives in a world where there are no memories of the past. And that was the That was the beginning of The Giver. I never got a chance to tell my father that, and nor did he ever get a chance to read the book. That's too bad.
All right, May Toms, you are all set to answer your, ask your question.
I didn't have a question. I don't know how I got on there.
Oh, okay, you have your hand up. Well, that's okay. We'll move on. Jennifer Rodriguez.
Hi, Lois. Oh, this is so awesome. I'm so intrigued by your stories. Very engaging. I'm a 6th grade ELA, advanced ELA teacher, and being this pandemic going on, we created a book club and we're reading Number the Stars.
Mm-hmm.
And the students are so engaged in the book and we love going in deep with them. And my question for you is, hopefully when we get back to the classroom, how would you suggest we engage students in writing that feel that they're not great writers? Because we come across that quite often.
I think I will preface this by saying I'm not a teacher. I've never been a teacher, and I admire teachers greatly. And when they ask my advice, I'm always so intimidated because they know so much more than I do about how to teach kids. But I would say I think it's intimidating, even probably for, I don't know, probably John Updike would have been intimidated if somebody had given him a pen and a piece of paper and said, write a great story. That's kind of unnerving. But kids are natural storytellers. Listen to them on a playground, or have a kid come to you at breakfast and say, I had this dream last night, and they'll tell you a story. I think if they're encouraged not to write in a formal sense a story, but to tell something as if you're telling it to your best friend. Tell what happened. Pretend something happened to you and tell about it to your best friend, I think is a good way to start with a kid.
Thank you so much.
Christopher Newcomb, you are all set to ask your question.
Hi, thanks. Lois, this is wonderful. I'm a teacher in Raymond, Maine, and we are reading Gathering Blue right now, and the kids absolutely adore it.
Oh, great.
Well, first of all, I have two questions. One is not about this at all, but that painting behind you, who painted that? It's beautiful.
I wish I could show you more of it. Let me see if well, the light is on it. That's by a Maine painter named Philip Barter. And I bought it from him at his studio, which is way up the coast, and I don't remember the name of the town, but it's above Ellsworth. It was years ago that I was there, and I assume he's still there. And in fact, I have on my coffee table a book of paintings, with paintings by Philip Barter. I admire his work greatly. So I'm glad you asked about that.
Well, thanks. So anyway, we're reading Gathering Blue, which they adore. It's really wonderful, and it's a great time to do it. But one of my questions is, when you wrote Gathering Blue, did you intentionally decide to have it connected to The Giver, or did that come later?
Oh, interesting question. Yeah, you caught me. No, I didn't. It was some years after The Giver had been published. I sat down to write a new book. A girl had appeared in my consciousness, in my imagination. She came with a name, the way they often do, and she came in my imagination in this odd circumstance, seated in this very primitive, awful place next to the body of her mother. And I wrote that scene, and I didn't know where it was going to go. And I thought, goodness, this is set in some prehistoric time. I thought I was going to have to research woolly mammoths or something. But it turned out, as I approached, it got further along in the book, it became clear that this was a future time. And I don't know if you've reached this point in the book yet, but the girl describes a time in the past, and what she describes is the bombing of the World Trade Center. And the interesting thing is that the book was written and published before that happened. So that's a kind of mysterious thing that I've never been able to explain. But so it's in the future, but it's after catastrophic events which have caused people to lose their technology and live in a very primitive fashion. And as I approached the ending of it, I realized that I could connect it to The Giver. And so many people had asked for a sequel to The Giver that it seemed like a good thing to do. The connection is subtle, and kids notice it, but adults sometimes don't. And then the third book makes much clearer what that connection is. And the fourth book then ties them all together.
That's great. Thank you.
Elizabeth Hall, you're all set to ask your question.
Or maybe she isn't.
Elizabeth, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep. Hi, the question is from my daughter.
Okay.
How old were you when you started writing?
How old was I when I started writing? I started writing about the time I started reading and realized that people wrote stories. But it was probably from the time I was 8 or so that I realized I wanted to be a writer. And when I was 10, in 1947, I subscribed to a children's magazine that every month had 2 pages of letters from kids. And I used to write letters to that magazine all the time. And the summer that I was 10 years old, they published my letter. And I hadn't thought about that for many years, but somebody doing research at the university, at Brigham Young University, found that letter in that magazine and sent it to me. And it says in it, I am writing a book called A Dog Named Lucky. I am on chapter 13. I don't remember A Dog Named Lucky. I never finished that book, but I was always writing books when I was that age, 10 years old. I went on to major in writing in college. So it was what I always wanted to do, but I'd been doing it since I was 8 or 9.
And we'll have to take our last question just because we're getting close to 8 o'clock. But Joseph Murray Frink, you're all set to ask your question.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi, Lois. I was wondering what sparked your writing career. What kind of kicked it off?
Say that last part again. Or what kicked it off? Well, as I say, I majored in writing in college. Then, like many women in the 50s, I dropped out of college and married right after I turned 19 years old. And then I had 4 children before I was 25. So it took me a little while to get back to writing. I went back to college too, back to graduate school. And then I began as a journalist and a photographer. But then what got me to writing for kids was this. I published a short story in a magazine. It was a story for adults. It was a magazine for adults. But the story was seen through the eyes of a child. And a children's book editor read it and wrote me a letter. She didn't know how to reach me. She sent the letter to the magazine. They forwarded it to me. And she said, you sound like somebody who could write for young people. Would you consider writing a book for our company? It was a publishing company. And that was such a wonderful invitation. They didn't promise to publish it, but it was nice to have somebody interested in it and ready to look at it when I finished. And that's when I wrote my first book, which they did publish, and they became my publisher for maybe 43 other books.
Thank you for that.
Yep, thank you.
Great. Well, Lois, I think we should probably conclude. Thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us. It's great. Always a great honor to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. This was fun for me. A nice change from just sitting alone.
Yes. And I want to say thanks to everybody out there who's listening now and who paid attention earlier in our chat. It's great to have so many people involved. Thank you for caring about the newspaper. Thank you for caring about Lois's writing and for paying attention to what we're doing. And everybody have a great evening.
Thanks, Bob.